So, what to do? I'd like to offer some solutions for the latter half of this talk. And one is I think we could start with language. Since language is the place where our ideas come into the world, come into fruition, where they become real. We've been taught, unfortunately, to talk of trees as resources. Wilderness is management units. Pikas gathering grass for winter because of quote-unquote incentives. And the problem here is when you frame conversations in these sort of economic terms, you limit the possible alternatives. You pigeonhole the conversation. This also steers the conversation away from the very living and breathing plants and animals. And instead it reframes their lives in this abstract mumbo-jumbo. But let me explain why this happens. And this is really important. Resources must be measurable. They must be commensurate, capable of being measured by a common standard. Now what this involves is abstraction, translation, and a value. Think about time for 1 second. We can have experiences, but then time can be abstracted from that experience, rendered mechanical via the clock, given a value. Just like, think, space can be abstracted from place, becomes property. It's suddenly measurable land. Same way, trees are abstracted into board feet. Rivers are abstracted into acre feet. Beauty is abstracted into a scene whose value is measured by Facebook likes. If you think about a walk in the bob, this generates cash and jobs, and then we can compare that to, say, grazing or logging or other things on not in the wilderness area, but on lands that, well, you can in some wilderness areas. What's happening is now we can compare benefits between the two activities. Your walk in the bob has been reduced to an economic benefit. We can compare them. But what I want to say most importantly is that nothing of great value is either abstract or commensurate. If you think about your hand, workman's comp can tell you the value of your hand. You tell me the value of your hand. Think about your daughter. A litigation lawyer, the insurance company, they can tell you the value of your daughter. Think about your lover's hair. Think about a creek. Think about your family farm. Grizzlies in the bob. Take and carefully imagine each of these beloved people, places, things, and reduce them, abstract them into economic language. Even worse, regarding abstraction, the founder of experimental physiology, Claude Bernard, said that man no longer, quote-unquote, hears the cry of animals, no longer sees the blood that flows. He sees only his idea and perceives only organisms concealing problems which he intends to solve, end quote. So the screams in the laboratory become, quote, high-pitched vocalizations. So what do we do here? Refuse the economic language. Refuse the abstraction. Find a new way of describing the world and experiencing it. Let's redefine our relationship with wildness and wilderness. Here's sort of a funny example, but it's something I picked up on working in the park, and I think is absolutely true. You work in the park for very, very long, and you hear people come through saying, man, we just did Yellowstone, and now we're going to do Glacier. Or you hear people say, we're going to do Heaven's Peak today. We're going to do Swift Current. Everybody's always doing everything. And it's kind of funny if you think about it in one way, but in all seriousness, it's harmful in that it puts us as the, first of all, the almighty doers. Of course, we are the doers in this object-based language. We're doing things, always. And by us doing things, it implies a separation here. And that's where I have a problem. Because I might say I went and walked along a ridge, or I walked through a forest. There's no separation there. But us as the doer, there certainly is. Another example comes from the abstract wild. Is the Amish quilt story. And this is a fascinating story. It's about an Amish auction. So the auction is roped off, and money certainly changes hands within the rope, but not outside of the rope. And so there's an Amish quilt, and someone asks from outside, why don't you sell it in New York or London or somewhere where you could get 5 or 10 times what it's worth, and so on. The person replies, then we can't afford it, then we won't be able to afford it. It won't keep us warm on a cold winter night. In other words, the value of that quilt was driven by people and place within that rope. it was not driven by some exterior global economy. We too, at any point in time, can rope off a place and say, these are the values we place there. And they don't have to be based on outside economic forces. Talk differently. So be careful. Pay attention to your language. Don't describe living beings and living systems of beings in economic terms. I mean, if trees are very alive and they're literally giving you breath, they're the other side of this idea of lungs, they're the lungs of the earth, well then don't describe them in board feet. Don't reduce them to that economic language. If language is our first mechanism to try and make some sort of reconciliation with the natural world here, then I think overhauling the scientific fundamentalism mindset of our culture is second. Especially since science drives so many management decisions and limits our wilderness conversations as well. When what is only measurable is considered real, then we ignore vast realities of our lives. Think of love, faith, honor, hope, these intangibles I mentioned a minute ago. We have based vast portions of our lives around these things that we can't hold, we can't touch, we can't measure, and we can't quantify. Yet we marry people. We live in certain places. These are all based on these things. Yet science says we can't measure them. They're not real. Here's the deal. We're all scientists. It's a way of looking at things. It's a way of trying to understand things. I almost went to med school because I found the body absolutely fascinating, and I still do. So science is not inherently good or bad. No more inherently good or bad than technology, say. But they both have very obvious on-the-ground effects. And I hate to say it, but upon close inspection, when you look at conservation biology and ecology, they do seem to be deeply driven by human-meted control of the wild. Once again, the opposite of that self-willed and autonomous wild of Thoreau's definition. And interestingly, opposite of the very quality or condition these disciplines are supposedly studying. And what we find then are paradoxes of control. We have wildlife management, wildfire management, wilderness management, managing for change, managing natural systems, mimicking natural disturbance. What I think is important here is to say, why so much attempt to control through science and management? But why through science? And this is important. Take biodiversity as an example, and I'm going to quote from Jack Turner here. He says, since biodiversity is understood on the model of a scarce resource, the preservation of biodiversity becomes a problem like resource management. In the face of biodiversity loss, then there surely is such a crisis. Conservation biology demands that we do something now. And the only way that counts is doing something. More money, more research, more technology, more information, more acreage. Trust science, trust technology, trust experts. They know best. In short, the prescription for the malady is even more control. To continue quoting Turner, these controls are always disciplinary or proto-disciplinary in nature, and the multiple meanings of discipline here are not accidental. They involve capturing, shooting, darting, netting, trapping, apprehending, arresting, isolating in special areas, wards, prisons, refuges, wildernesses, numerical identification, tattooing and tagging everything from inmates and soldiers to swans and grizzlies, chemical manipulation of germs, of the brain, of fertility, monitoring, radio collaring, ankle monitors on prisoners, and constant surveillance to accumulate even more information. Having severely intruded upon the human body and mind, we now intend to intrude upon the rest of creation, thus confirming the forecast in Ecclesiastes. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. I think that's 3:19. So, what you always hear people saying, but I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to help. And in fact, if you don't do any of these things, then you aren't helping. And then you get criticized as not caring about nature often. But what I want to ask is, well, what are we trying to help? Are we trying to help wildness? Are we trying to help species? Are we trying to help some measurable outcome? David Graeber from the National Biological Survey put this well. He wrote, parks are increasingly becoming ecological islands as the landscapes that surround them are converted to agriculture or development. Thus, while climate change can be expected to lead to the local extirpation of species in parks, the invasions of many native quote-unquote replacement species, those adapted to the new climate, will be blocked by isolation. The intentional introduction or maintenance of native species could in some cases be used to facilitate the introduction of species that would have arrived on their own before habitat fragmentation, as well as to preserve the survival of other species that would no longer be sufficiently adapted to persist under the new climatic and ecological conditions. Such intensive management is likely to be needed to preserve species of plants and animals that are already are local in distribution. Now follow the last paragraph here. To manage parks in this way emphatically abandons the contemporary, ecologically based notion of wildness. We indeed become trapped into caring for the rest of life in a transformed world. So what I wonder here is, do we want wildness? Do we want a terrarium? Following this line of thinking, are we the caretakers of the whole cosmos? You know, in all honesty, knowing what we now know about complex systems, for instance, is tinkering with the wild even reasonable? Muir nailed it back in 1911 when he wrote, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." This is what we're discovering about complex systems. And if you can look anywhere from physics to modern biology and see the impact that complex systems has had on our present thinking over the last few decades. But, I mean, Flathead Lake, the opossum shrimp example, Moxie shrimp, lake trout today, the Yellowstone elk herd. These are examples of complex systems that we've tinkered with and have had consequences beyond what we would have ever imagined. Plus, I've been studying a lot of math and physics lately. If you look into the observer effect, the uncertainty principle, what these two basically say is we have no idea what we're doing. Nor can we know. Look at chaos theory. Really been into this lately. Essentially, it says there can be no long-term quantitative prediction. What it also does say, though, that's fascinating, is that nonlinear systems do have a remarkable talent for self-organization. Nature does have a remarkable talent for self-organization. But what does this do for prediction? I mean, are we ballparking species and landscapes? Let me quote Jack Turner here. He says, "What happens to the rationality of managing species and ecosystems without accurate prediction and control? If the microsystems of an ecosystem, from vascular flow to genetic drift to turbulence, plus all of the natural disturbances to ecosystems, weather, fire, the front of a wildfire is a fractal, wind, earthquakes, avalanches, if all these exhibit chaotic and or complex behavior, and some organize themselves at a global level to critical states resulting in catastrophic events, and further, if such behavior does not allow long-term quantitative predictions, then isn't ecosystems management a bit of a sham? The management of grizzlies and wolves at best a tragedy? If an ecosystem can't be known or controlled with scientific data, then why don't we simply can all the talk of ecosystem health and integrity and admit, honestly, it's just public policy, not science?" Where I'm going with all of this is the limits of our knowledge should define the limits of our practice. If you look at geneticists and think about DNA, geneticists will be the first to tell you we don't know what we're doing, and that's spooky. The atomic physicists will be the first to tell you we don't know what we're doing with the atom, and that's spooky. So maybe we should draw some limits there. Maybe we shouldn't tinker with DNA, maybe we shouldn't be tinkering with the atom. Conservation biologists don't typically say, we don't know what we're doing with wilderness. We don't know what we're doing with wildness. But maybe we should draw a boundary there too, with our wilderness areas. Maybe those should be the areas that are off limits. Those could be the areas that serves as benchmarks of natural processes, as benchmarks of places left alone. The real issue here is not the legitimacy of science. And let me repeat that. The real issue here is not the legitimacy of science, but I think humility. And this occurred to me the other day. I really believe that perhaps for the first time in the history of humanity, what might mark our highest form of humility will be admitting our own limits. The limits of science, the limits of technology, the limits of religion, the limits of everything. For the first time ever, I think, well, it's quite obvious we're a threat to ourselves and to the rest of the world. But for the first time ever, perhaps we need to admit our limits. And that could be our highest form of humility, of morality. I do get tired of hearing people all the time saying, but now we know, now we know. We used to terrace, but now we know. We used to clear cut, but now we know. I don't ever hear anyone say, we don't know. That's what I want to hear. Instead, 10 years from now we're going to say, no, now we know how to do it. In 2012 we didn't, in 2013 we didn't, but now we do. Is this going to go on forever and ever? I have no reason not to think so. Fabulous book, Grizzly Country by Andy Russell. He explains this idea of limits really well. The limits of knowledge, the limits of wisdom, the limits of practice. He begins the book as an outfitter in Alberta. He spent the first half of his life as an outfitter. And he writes eloquently about how there were experiences as a hunter that he had, with grizzlies particularly, that he could have had no other way. That act of hunting allowed him entrance into a certain wisdom that could only be found through that experience. But then he trades the gun for a pen and a camera and decides to embark on a different mission for the second part of his life. And he vehemently argues that he had experiences that he could have never had with the gun. And so he said neither is better or worse, but they are different. Each has its own unique wisdom. Each has its own unique limitations. And this is what I'm getting at with science, with technology, with religion, with all of these things that seem to steer our lives and that we place value on. The limits of our knowledge should define the limits of our practice. And this idea of limits brings me naturally to the idea of non-invasive techniques and practices in conservation biology and ecology. No more control-based science is what I'm getting at here. If you think about when humans are collared, they're usually being arrested. They're under house arrest, military arrest. They're in slavery. They're in prison. Think about that for a second and then think how wild are these animals that we have collared in the parks and the wilderness areas. It always helps to turn things around on myself, and I find myself doing this all the time. But as far as invasive science goes, I do ask myself, would I collar my wife? Would I collar my kids? What is that implying in our relationship there? Would I want myself collared? That's an easy one. And then I set up these little analogies to where I turn things around on myself. And I thought for a second the other day, if you look at the majority of the invasive science that's going on today, it's just documenting the death of species, at least it seems that way. And so I thought, what if my family, my people or whatever, our land base was damaged by some outside force, aliens, another species, whatever, that doesn't matter. But say our land base was damaged where we were having a hard time getting food and water, shelter, these basic things essential for life. And yet this other species or these aliens or whoever caused this to happen, they want to now study us as we die. So they show up at the door. They want to sedate me. They want to collar me. They want to do all these things, What I want to say in that situation is no. Go collar yourself. We didn't do this. You did. Why don't you go and consider yourself for a little bit and leave us alone? Watch us from your binoculars from the hillside. That's fine. But don't sedate us. Don't collar us. It's almost like humans have forgotten their own golden rule. Because I don't think they would like it. Not to mention, radio collars have never once saved me and my people from angry poachers, from trucks, from trains, from zoos. They may help in some abstract way that I don't understand, but on the ground I don't know what they're doing for me. And this invasive science is everywhere. That's the problem. I'll quote the April 27, 2011 Glacier National Park Harlequin Duck press release, which says, quote unquote, researchers will use radio telemetry and banding to expand knowledge of where harlequins nest and the factors affecting nest success and chick survival. The information collected in this study will be used to help bolster the current knowledge of this species in Glacier National Park in Montana. First of all, I find it interesting. It's only to bolster the knowledge. It's not actually to help the birds. Anyway, continuing the quote, harlequins are at high risk of local extinction due to their very limited numbers, limited habitat, overhunting occurring outside the state, sensitivity to disturbance, and habitat loss or alteration. Continue. Sensitivity to disturbance. That caught my eyes instantly. So, what I ask here is, what about the roads? What about the constructions? What about the helicopter overflights? What about the traffic? What about the biologists? You do realize the biologists are herding harlequins downstream into nets, at which point they ban them. Sensitivity to disturbance. Think also, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks research article titled, quote-unquote, Grizzly Bear Population Vital Rates and Trends in the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem, Montana. And this says, quote, we captured grizzly bears using leg hole snares and culvert traps, by helicopter darting, and in some instances we darted and immobilized bears over baits. And these are females, mind you, that they needed for this study. So, you don't have to look far to see invasive science everywhere. Another offshoot of this that I wonder about all the time, and I call this the million-dollar question here, is, most of these studies cost millions of dollars because they usually last 5 or 10 years, and they almost always yield the obvious. If you take a 5th grader with a level head and show them the historical and then present range of, say, the Canada lynx or the grizzly bear, and they will tell you they need more habitat. Well, that's the same thing these decade-long studies will tell you. They need more habitat. Duh. We knew that at the beginning. What if we took the millions of dollars and simply bought habitat for them? Then we wouldn't need all this data for future court battles, which is the argument I seem to always hear. Well, we need the data for future court battles. Well, you wouldn't have future court battles if these animals had a home. The other thing is, with invasive science, is we never seem to sit and let the animals come to us. As a culture, we don't ever sit and let anything come to us. That's anti-axiomatic of our culture. But if you think about Doug Peacock, think about Andy Russell, think about Adolph Murray, think about that unique wisdom that those people learned from letting those animals come to them, from knowing animals as individuals and not just as numbers. That's something that science can't and won't ever have. Cannot attain. So I guess what I'm saying, non-invasive science is great. I love science. I love learning. But I really wish we could admit our limits and understand our limits and define our roles by those limits. Remember the high-pitched vocalizations? Let's leave the animals alone. Another solution here, and perhaps a third way to reconcile our relationship with wilderness, is to understand the full-scale implications of wilderness tourism, and then perhaps dream of a new way to interact with the wild. Let me quote and link from Jack Turner here. The national parks were created for and by tourism, and they emphasize what interests a tourist, the picturesque and the odd. They are managed with 2 ends in mind, entertainment and preservation of the resource base for entertainment. Most visitors rarely leave their cars except to eat, sleep, or go to the John. If visitors do make stops, it's at designated picturesque scenes or educational exhibits presenting amusing facts, None of this is accidental. It results from carefully crafted management plans that channel the flow of tourists according to maximum utility. Utility defined by the ends of entertainment, efficiency, and resource preservation. The problem is not what people do in the parks, but what they are discouraged or prevented from doing. No one, for instance, is encouraged to climb mountains, backpack, or canoe alone. Hikers are discouraged from traveling off-trail, especially in unpatrolled areas with difficult rescue. We are often prohibited from visiting remote areas where we might encounter bears. Our movements are always subjected to what Foucault calls normalizing surveillance. There are traffic police, climbing police, river police, and backcountry police that carry guns and mace, wear bulletproof vests, levy fines. It's illegal to wander around the national parks without a permit defining where you stay and how long you stay. In every manner conceivable, national parks separate us from the freedom that is the promise of the wild. If we go into a designated wilderness area, say the Bridger Teton Wilderness in Wyoming, we are slightly less restricted, but we find as much degradation of the wild environment. We see signs and hike horse trails and cross sturdy bridges and find maps on large boards at trail junctions. We meet patrolling rangers, Boy Scout and Girl Scout groups working on character, and an Outward Bound course teaching wilderness skills and a corporate management seminar. We meet trail crews, pack trains, and hikers galore. At night we see the distant lights of cities and highways and sodium vapor lamps in the yards of farms and ranches. Satellites pass overhead. By day, contrails from commercial jets mar the sky, military planes, private jets, small aircraft, and helicopters shatter any calm. If we wander out of this narrow wilderness zone, we walk straight into clear-cut forest, logging roads, oil wells. This is not the wild, not a wilderness, and yet we continue to accept it as wilderness and call our time there a wilderness experience. We believe that we make contact with the wild, but this is an illusion. In both the national parks and wilderness areas, we accept a reduced category of experience, a semblance of the wild nature, a fake, and no one complains. Continue quoting from Turner. Wilderness tourism is devoted to fun. We hunt for fun, fish for fun, climb for fun, ski for fun, and hike for fun. This is the grim harvest of the fun hog philosophy that powered the wilderness recreation boom for 3 decades, the philosophy of Outside Magazine and dozens of its ilk. For crying out loud, and this is me talking now, we have people in Glacier Park climbing mountains by following a dotted line in a book. How wild of an experience is that? You know, my thoughts on this, recreate for sure. Bears slide down snowfields, dolphins ride waves. I have fun doing it, my kids do. But consider this too. If I had a nickel for every letter I wrote on behalf of the 2000 roadless rule, I'd have a good chunk of change. Went door to door, I did all this stuff to try and to help that move through legislation. And then one day I discovered this. And this is a PDF from the Big Mountain from 2000 sent into the Forest Service that pretty much opposed everything to do with the roadless rule. You know, and the Big Mountain was a place that I worked. The Big Mountain was a place I recreated all the time. Now the Big Mountain just got approved by the Whitefish City Council to expand the glades by another 12.5 acres. You know, they're going to put the other chairlift in on the back side. I don't typically support mountains full of clear cuts to begin with. So this made me rethink my idea of recreation. The other thing with wilderness tourism, there's typically a little emotional connection. So there's hardly any art, literature, poetry, myths, lore, anything that really stems from wilderness that has a depth to it. What we end up with are tons of coffee table books full of facts and pictures and amusing details. So there's no phonology. Phonology is a place where ecology is not studied but felt. These are truths like a kid learning, you know, hot or cold. These can't be taken away. I think what's happened with wilderness tourism is we've traded, in our culture actually in general, is we've traded wisdom for cleverness. But I guess the one thing with wilderness tourism is that it's a little emotional connection, but it might be the beginning of a deeper connection. Someone goes on a trip in the backcountry of the park or the Bob or something, they might not have the skills to, or whatever it takes to necessarily go do that on their own. So that might spark something deep inside of them that they might end up with a lifetime of fighting for wild places and wild things. I guess my deal is just don't confuse the two in language. A drive up the Going to the Sun Road is not like a week off trail in the Nyack or the Bob. They're different. And I'm not saying one is better or worse, and I'm not saying one is more pure or less pure or whatever, but I'm saying they're different. And when I hear that same old argument about, well, if nobody comes to the park and drives the road, well, how are they going to go home and fight for wilderness? Well, I don't think anyone driving the Going to the Sun Road is really going to go home and fight for wilderness, much less wildness. They're going to fight for clean bathrooms, good parking lots, friendly rangers, all these things that made their experience positive. You know, it's just hard to fight for, say, chocolate if you've never tasted chocolate. So, one experience off trail, alone, deep in the Bob, that's direct, that's visceral. That is not filtered through other people, through establishments and through protocols and so on. So they're different. They're different experiences. Let me close this part by quoting from Turner one more time here. We treat the natural world according to our experience of it, without aura, wildness, magic, spirit, holiness, the sacred and soul. We treat flora, fauna, art, and landscape as resources and amusement. Fun. Their importance is merely a function of current, fashion, and hobbies. And this is all fine, but what is sad to me is there is no wilder option. The wildest option is not there. So a fourth way to reconcile our relationship with wilderness is to reconsider the modern environmental movement, the tactics. We seem to win battles, but we're losing the war. Is the easiest way to explain it. In Endgame, Derek Jensen writes something interesting. He talks about a book called The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton. And he writes how Lifton, quote-unquote, explored how it was that men who had taken the Hippocratic Oath could participate in prisons where inmates were worked to death or killed in assembly lines. He found that many of the doctors honestly cared for their charges and did everything within their power, which means pathetically little, to make life better for the inmates. If an inmate got sick, they might give the inmate an aspirin to lick. They might put the inmate to bed for a day or two, but not for too long, or the inmate might be selected for murder. If the patient had a contagious disease, they might kill the patient to keep the disease from spreading. All of this made sense within the confines of Auschwitz. The doctors once again did everything they could to help the inmates, except for the most important thing of all. They never questioned the existence of Auschwitz itself. They never questioned working the inmates to death. They never questioned starving them to death. They never questioned imprisoning them. They never questioned torturing them. They never questioned the existence of a culture that would lead to these atrocities. They never questioned the logic that leads inevitably to the electrified fences, the gas chambers, and the bullets in the brain. Jensen continues here. We as environmentalists do the same. We work as hard as we can to protect the places we love, using the tools of the system as best we can. Yet we do not do the most important thing of all. We do not question the existence of this death culture. We do not question the existence of an economic and social system that is working the world to death, that is starving it to death, that is imprisoning it, that is torturing it. We never question a culture that leads to these atrocities. We never question the logic that inevitably leads to clear cuts, murdered oceans, loss of topsoil, dammed rivers, poisoned aquifers. And we certainly don't act to bring it down. Mind you, this all comes from a man wearing a raccoon sweater. Pretty tough. So what do you do in the world of environmental tactics? I don't know. You can play the trespassing game. That just seems to me to be too prescribed a little dance. You sit somewhere, you get arrested for trespassing. Everybody feels great. The cops feel great. They arrested the perpetrators. You feel great. You stood up for your cause. Most importantly, though, those in power feel great because nothing happens. So what do? I think we change the conversation. I think we change the rules. Change the language. Thinking about forward solutions, going beyond what we've talked about, it just seems obvious wilderness is doomed if we can't stop civilization. If we can't stop ourselves, this is no other species' fault. We can't control ourselves, so what do? We project that control on nature. Perhaps instead of worrying about other species, about acreage, about radio collars, maybe we could worry a little more about ourselves. We're the cause. The fact that animals no longer have a home is not their fault, it's ours. And I don't know why that's so hard to understand. But geez, Holloway, how to stop culture? It's a lot easier to manipulate nature. That's the darn truth. My solution is start with yourself. Confucius wrote in the Great Digest, wanting good government in their states, they first established order in their own families. Wanting order in the home, they first disciplined themselves. So how to start with ourselves? I think be honest. And this might be my favorite quote of the night coming up next. And this is from John Livingston, again, the Canadian naturalist. He wrote, "You might go so far as to say that if we cannot appreciate the nature and quality of our acts and anticipate at least some of their consequences, then we have no right to describe ourselves as intelligent, much less sane." I like it so much I'm going to read it again. You might go so far as to say that if we cannot appreciate the nature and quality of our acts and anticipate at least some of their consequences, then we have no right to describe ourselves as intelligent, much less sane. Yet, we pretend oil will last forever, even though petroleum geologists tell us otherwise. And that's just a small example. You know, if you think about if any other species did the things that we do today, I don't know, school shootings, suicides, war, they would be deemed irrefutably insane. And we would deem them irrefutably insane. And I think the majority of the insanity here pretty much, well, I think it's just an extension of our denial. And that's what I meant by be honest. No more denial. Because I think denial keeps us from doing the real work, and that's the worst problem with it. Management, policies, science, all this stuff veils and disguises the real work to be done. More money, more studies, they're not going to help. Look around. They don't already. They keep the real truth and the real needs at bay. What do? We treat the symptoms. We don't treat the causes. This is axiomatic of modern culture. We treat grizzly bears that get into garbage, not so much the people that leave the garbage out. I mean, from medicine to politics, religion, conservation biology, and so on, we treat symptoms. We don't treat causes. This is an extension of the denial. If we really wanted to help the Harlequin ducks, we'd do something with the Going to the Sun Road. If we really wanted to do the real work, we would put denial to the side. This being a first step, I think the next logical step is become critics with solutions. Find your own niche and fight. This is huge because each of us has our own individual concerns, our own individual voices. That's critical. That's important. I can't work for the National Park Service anymore. Thank God Cal Johnson does, or we'd have more concrete up at Avalanche than we already do now. I don't go to the Whitefish Wilderness Range meetings. Thank God Frank Vitelli does. We all have our own ways of being critics, of coming up with solutions and fighting. My job is to sit at home and write. I criticize and I try and provide solutions. That's my job. I'm trying to keep the flame of wildness alive in wildernesses. But collectively, I think we can make a difference. Everyone in their own way, collectively will make a difference. About once a month I read Edward Abbey's Writer's Credo. It fuels me. It regrounds me. But I think when he writes, and that applies to people that aren't just writers. I think it applies to anyone and everyone. And I'm going to continue reading after this quote ends. But he writes, "The moral duty of the free writer is to begin his work at home, to be a critic of his own community, his own country, his own culture. The more freedom the writer possesses, the greater moral obligation to play the role of the critic." That last line is hugely important. The more freedom the writer possesses, the greater the moral obligation to play the role of the critic. In the global scheme of things, we have tremendous freedom. Therefore, we have tremendous moral obligation to play the role of the critic, as Abbey wrote. He continued to say, "Why write? Speaking for myself," this is Abbey, "I write to entertain my friends and exasperate our enemies. I write to record the truth of our time as best I can see it, to oppose, resist, and sabotage the contemporary drift toward a global technocratic police state, whatever its ideological coloration. I write to oppose injustice, to defy power, and to speak for the voiceless. I write to make a difference, to honor life, and to praise the divine beauty of the natural world." If he's considered a radical, we need a whole world full of radicals. I've proposed alternatives to language, science, management, our own culturally driven lifestyles. And perhaps another solution here is one place left alone, one place left wild, one place truly wild. Maybe it's the Nyack in the park. Maybe it's the North Fork of the Sun and the Bob. Maybe it's the whole park. Maybe it's the whole Bob. But it's a place against which we can measure ourselves. It's a place left alone. It's a place free from helicopters, scientists, search and rescues, trail crews, restoration crews, conservation strategies, roads, satellite surveillance, radio collars, measuring devices, GPS data. We'd obviously still need to police ourselves, but let the land be. Let the place go back to its own self-order as much as possible. I get a lot of flack from a lot of people because they say I'm selfish. I want to exclude mountain bikes. I want to exclude all these things from the wilderness areas. But I guess I go back to saying, where is the wild option possible? Where is that wildest option possible? It's not. So I have a hard time seeing myself as selfish in this. Mountain bikers have millions of acres. Scientists have the whole dang world. Where is that one wild option? It's not there. One problem is there's no money in this approach. The other thing is, I don't want my friends not to be able to be guides, packers, rangers, these jobs that actually are meaningful and important. I'm proud of my friends for not sitting behind desks and just making other people money. But I do wish we had one place. I do wish we had one place. And the no search and rescue thing, that always freaks people out when I bring that up. But let me make this clear. What I mean by that is enter at your own risk. I don't mean you're going to go out there and something happened and suddenly you discover you can't be rescued. I mean you don't go in there with the possibility of being rescued. And the reason I think this is hugely important is there's no bailout. And that, I think, would cause people to look at the wilderness very differently and, most importantly, act very differently there. It would really help curb that destructive mindset of that reduces our national forests and our parks to mere public playgrounds. Abby put that really well in the Numa Ridge Lookout. I think it would change the way we act a lot. But there's this thing called global SAR I found on the internet the other day. No elevation too high. They'll go anywhere on the whole planet and get you. You pay a yearly fee. I guess there's somewhere in Afghanistan, or a few places probably, that they have to check their code of the day and see if they'll go or not. But, I mean, there's nowhere left, Quote Doug Peacock from Grizzly Years, possibly my favorite nonfiction book. He writes, "What is missing from our woods and mountains is a spectrum of wilderness possibilities. We keep eliminating the wildest option, the original landscape we called home for all but a heartbeat of human history. The trend is toward a homogeneously mediocre experience, a woods safe only for recreational diversion. Such a place need not include risk and unpredictable things like grizzly bears." So what am I really getting at here? I'm trying to reestablish a deeper and lasting relationship with wildness and with wilderness. I'm trying to reconcile our idea of wilderness with our alienation from home, from an ancestral home. We no longer see ourselves as part of the world, and the consequence is devastating. Innocent life is being killed every second. The wonderful writer Anne Pancake said this to me in an email, and I think she nailed it here. "Our separation from our environment and our alienation from wilderness leads to so much self-destructive behavior in us. And when we are self-destructive, we take down those around us. And of course, I don't just mean humans." So how do you reestablish a deeper, more lasting relationship with wilderness, with the landscape? Everybody loves Aldo Leopold. Start with his land ethic. "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." This is ethical talk. And if you follow this line of thinking as ethical, then that means the last 10,000 years of our culture is downright evil. So, how do you act out this land ethic? I think you start by asking the right questions. People wear the WWJD bracelets. I say, ask the grizzly. This is what I always do in my head when I'm out cruising around the woods. I say, ask the grizzly. This is from the book that I'm working on. I say, with every waking moment of our day, whether we're biologists, rangers, sous chefs, math teachers, preachers, plumbers, prostitutes, whomever, we need to ask the land if our personal decisions are good for it. The long-term health and wildness of it. We need to ask the grizzly if our decisions are good for the grizzly. Ask the whitebark pine if our decisions are good for the whitebark pine. Ask the harlequin duck if our decisions are good for the harlequin duck. Ask the mountain, trees, wind, and sky if our decisions are good for them. In Glacier National Park, would a grizzly approve of going to the Sun Road? Not a chance. Would a grizzly endorse scenic helicopter flights? No. Would a grizzly applaud chainsaws and dynamite for trail maintenance? Not likely. Would a grizzly approve of collars, culvert traps, science management? Absurd. Would a grizzly tolerate a small human presence in the backcountry, on the trails and the campgrounds, climbing mountains? Absolutely. Humans have been a part of the grizzly's existence for thousands of years. If the possibility of coexistence is real as the chance, or the possibility of coexistence is real as the chance of making compassionately intelligent decisions, if we ask the right questions. If nobody asks the grizzly, we'll never learn to listen. The truer way to reconcile our relationship with wilderness is to reconnect to the natural world through our emotions. We will only fight for that which we love, and we will not fight for that which we do not love. And I ask you here tonight, do we love the wild? And this must be an emotional and visceral connection. Do we have an emotional connection with the wild? When we see clear cuts, like kids being raped, I think then I can say yes. I don't know how to do this. Imagine a different relationship with wildness. Experience a different relationship with wildness. Direct, visceral connection. This takes time, care, patience, respect. It takes generations. But I say hike alone. I say go off trail. Go out for weeks at a time. Eat from the land. Of course, you can't hunt the king's game. Out of season, of course, so you're going to have to be a vegetarian hippie, and you're going to have to eat roots and tubers and berries and stuff. But, you know, in all honesty, think, what if this was our calendar? This is the traditional calendar of the Salish people. January was the shake hands month. That's when they came together and were glad for another year of knowing one another. February was the coldest month. March, the month of the geese. April, the buttercup month. May, the month of the bitterroot. June, month of the camas. July was the celebration month. But then August, the huckleberry. September, the chokecherry. October, the hunting month. November, the storytelling month. And December, the trapping month. Do you see how differently we would see our relationship with the wild if that was our calendar? Or another way to put this, as Jack Turner wrote, quote, if children were raised hearing stories of spotted owls, honoring them with their dances, imagining them in their dreams, and seeking the power of their gaze, then spotted owls would speak to us. Then we wouldn't have to worry about clear-cutting spotted owl habitat. And when wildfires articulated their needs, we would not drown them in chemicals. When wild rivers spoke, they would be cleared of dams, and the salmon would come home from the sea. Thank you.